I want you to imagine yourself at your favorite local cafe. I'm assuming, and I hope you like coffee, and you're there with one of your closest friends. You get together with this individual frequently. You've shared a lot of stories together about your work life, your family life. And on this particular day, you're sharing a couple stories about growing up, your childhood. And as you're talking back and forth, suddenly there's a pause. Your friend puts their head down and they gradually lift their head, not quite making eye contact. And they softly say across the table, "I was sexually abused when I was 9 years old." Let's freeze the picture right there. What are you thinking? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when your friend discloses that information? What do you feel? What do you do? What do you say? Do you say anything? There's an important observation here, and that is it's amazing that your friend disclosed their sexual abuse to you. The goal of this video is to inform us as to why disclosures of sexual abuse are so daunting for the survivor of abuse. And then also to inform us as to how we can respond in an informed and compassionate way. Too many segments of our society have not been safe places for disclosures of sexual abuse. An obvious example that has been in the news over and over again is the USA Gymnastics. Allegations against Olympic team doctor Larry Nassar that have been in the news in recent years did not begin just in the past few years. First allegations against Larry Nassar were back in 1997, 20 years ago, and yet for some reason overlooked during that long span of time. It is especially disturbing, at least to me, that the church is not a safe place for the disclosure of sexual abuse. In recent years, it's well publicized that disclosures of sexual abuse within the Southern Baptist Convention and within the Roman Catholic Church have not been responded to in a proper way. But we are ignorant if we think the problem only exists in the Southern Baptist Convention or the Roman Catholic Church. 16 years after Larry Nassar first sexually abused Olympic gymnast Rachel Denhollander, decided that she needed to state publicly what had happened. In a court statement, she mentioned that it took a long time for her to be able to share publicly how she had been sexually abused. The magazine Christianity Today picked up on that court statement and asked Rachel Denhollander, "Is the church included in that?" And here's what she said. "Yes, church is one of the least safe places to acknowledge abuse because the way it is counseled is more often than not damaging to the victim. There is an abhorrent lack of knowledge for the damage and devastation that sexual abuse brings. It is with deep regret that I say the church is one of the worst places to go for help." That is a hard thing to say because I am a very conservative evangelical, but that is the truth. There are very, very few who have ever found true help in the church. So again, the goal of this video and the ones that follow is to inform us as to why disclosures of sexual abuse are so daunting for the survivor of abuse, so that we can then offer responses that are informed and are compassionate. This is very important because the biggest variable in determining a healthy future for a survivor of sexual abuse is the variable of what happens when their abuse is first disclosed. When there is an appropriate response to that disclosure, the hope for a better future increases exponentially for that survivor. So here's our outline. We're going to look first of all at why survivors of sexual abuse are silenced. Secondly, we'll look at how disclosures have their own distinct characteristics. And then third, how can we respond with compassion? So first of all, why is it that survivors are silenced? There are at least 7 reasons why survivors are silenced. The first one, it begins with the perpetrator's grooming. And the perpetrator begins by grooming the victim. Grooming in childhood sexual abuse, grooming refers to the perpetrator's subtle, intentional, and insidious conditioning of the victim through verbal, physical, or emotional expressions for the purpose of sexually inappropriate advances of the perpetrator. Grooming is characterized by secrets, by simple touches, and by favors and gifts. Secrets form the framework for sexual abuse. The abuse occurs in secret. The victim is told this is a secret. And then simple touches become the devious conditioning towards more sexualized strokes. And then favors or gifts are the currency of sexual abuse. Olympic gymnast Aly Raisman speaks of how Larry Nassar gave her favors, gave her gifts as she was being sexually assaulted when she was 15 years old. She spoke of being under Nassar's spell. So the perpetrator grooms the victim, but the perpetrator also grooms the community. The goal of the perpetrator's grooming of the community is to condition the community to think that he or she would never do such a thing as sexual abuse. Their intent is to be so respected as a person that they would never be suspected of the sexual abuse. The methods of the perpetrator include gaining a position of power or authority. It also includes achieving status, and it can even include a charming personality. The perpetrator is not always the stereotypical creep. Sometimes it's the person least expected. So the outcome of the grooming then is to condition the community so that when accusations come against the perpetrator, the victim is suspected of lying. The victim is suspected of doing something that caused the sexual abuse. And the victim is sometimes told, you must have done something. The threatening natures of disclosure are like a spiral staircase, ascending a spiral staircase. You can't see what's at the top. And for the survivor of sexual abuse, the disclosure does not enable them to see what's ahead, what's at the top. It's too risky to disclose. Survivors are also silenced by the threats of the perpetrator. So the perpetrator grooms, but the perpetrator also extends threats. A perpetrator within the family system or who is a caregiver for the child might say something like this to the child. Now, we're not going to tell anyone. This is our secret, yours and my secret. Threats are common from perpetrators who are in a position of authority. A district attorney who was accused and was guilty of sexually assaulting a young girl during that abuse told that girl, I'm the district attorney and you're just a little girl. No one is ever going to believe you. The pastor of a youth group who sexually abused a 15-year-old girl within that youth group told her, this is really your fault. So threats come from the perpetrator because molesters rely upon their power. When the abuse occurs within the family system, here are some statements that are typically said to the victim of the abuse. If you tell anyone what has happened, then I will need to leave and you'll never see me again. Or if you tell anyone what has happened, it will ruin our family. Or I'm doing this because you're special. This is our secret. Or this is really your fault, If a family friend inflicts the abuse, the threats are very similar, with the whole intent of conditioning the child to believe that harm is going to come to them and or their family if they would ever disclose their abuse. Let's move on to the third reason why survivors are silenced, and that is the shame that is imposed upon the victim. Now let's distinguish between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am a mistake. The victim of sexual abuse is not guilty. It is the perpetrator of the abuse who is guilty of their vile act. But the victim does experience a shame that can actually paralyze. It can paralyze them emotionally and socially to the point where they are silenced, thinking to themselves, if anybody knew what really happened to me, they would know how damaged and dirty I am. That's all shame. Survivors of sexual abuse, unless they are receiving good counseling from a qualified counselor, they carry a heavy load of shame and self-blame. They think, I don't want others to know how bad I am, and therefore they are silent. We move on to the fourth reason why survivors are silenced, and that is because of the wounds inflicted by friends. These wounds being inflicted by the various responses, verbal responses to the disclosure. There are 4 types of response, wounding responses. The first one is the condemning response. We've already heard this condemning response. It is, well, you must have done something to cause it. That's a condemning response. The second type of wounding response is the disbelieving response. The disbelieving response is because of the grooming that the perpetrator has done of the community. So a person says to the victim, well, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so would never do something like sexual abuse. The third wounding response is belief but no response. This sometimes comes from a parent, the non-abusing parent. Let's say that the child is abused by the father or stepfather. However, the child's mother knows about it, has even heard the child talk about it, but does nothing. And in that action inflicts another form of abuse upon the child by their disbelieving response. And then there is the self-absorbed response, the type of response that actually would be so easy for any one of us to give. Let's go back to the cafe. You're sitting there across from your friend, and they've just shared with you that they were sexually abused when they were 9 years old. You've gotten together with this friend so many times, and now you're hearing this. So it's almost natural to say, oh, why are you telling me this just now? Or another form of that, why am I hearing about this for just the first time now? That response is detrimental in two ways, at least two ways. For one, it's a self-absorbed response. It's a response that's all about the person hearing it. It's as though they're saying, am I not more important to you that you would have told me sooner? It's self-absorbed. The second reason it's detrimental is because of how a victim of sexual abuse would hear it. They hear it as, if this was really true, you would have told me way earlier. It is so important that we understand all of the difficulties and challenges for a survivor disclosing their abuse, so that we can offer an informed and compassionate response. We've looked so far at 4 reasons why survivors are silenced. In the next video, we're going to look at responses from institutions and how detrimental those responses are to the survivor and how they further silence the survivor. If you in any way are in a leadership capacity in your organization, in your church, in your institution, you need to be sure to continue on with the next video.